Okay, so hello everyone and thank you for joining us today. We are recording this session, so just to be for everyone to be aware. So I'm Detective Inspector Fiona Bell, Head of Cyber and Innovation at the Eastern Cyber Resilience Centre. The Eastern Cyber Resilience Centre is a Home Office supported NPCC and regionally funded police-led not-for-profit membership organisation with the aim of increasing SMEs cyber resilience throughout our free membership. So today I am joined by two members of our advisory group and an IT professional to discuss the differences between IT support companies, otherwise known as managed service providers or MSPs, and cybersecurity companies. So as you talk, please feel free to pop any questions in the chat as we go along, or raise your hand and we'll do our best to answer them. So we'll start by introducing the panellists joining me. Steve, please can you tell everyone who you are and what your experience is within this area?
Hi, good morning everybody. So I'm Steve Mayer, I'm a principal consultant with Bridewell Consulting. I started in IT in the late 80s and transitioned through a number of different roles into security probably in the early 2000s. But saying that, even in the late 80s I was writing security policies around antivirus protection on floppy disks and things like that. So I like to say I've got 30 years plus experience in the security industry, have worked with SMEs, multinationals and foreign governments. So broad range of experience and a broad range of sort of technical background and experience in most things around information security. And I'll just add that as well as being an advisory group member, I'm also a She Leads Tech Advisor, ambassador with ISACA.
Brilliant. So David, what about yourself?
Hi, I'm David Farmer. I'm a director of Modus Scotland. We're an IT company now with 23 years experience in the IT support field. Prior to that, I was the IT manager for Railtrack in Scotland. So I've actually quite a bit of experience both of being in a team of a large organisation and supporting clients directly. And our clients range from small sole traders right up to national companies.
Excellent. And finally, Darren.
Thanks, Fiona. Good morning, everybody. My name is Darren Chapman. I'm owner and principal security consultant for Cyberscale. So we are a cybersecurity consulting and training company based in Norwich. And my background is very similar to Steve's. So I won't repeat it because he's done all that for you, but it's very similar. And it's a company, so we sort of concentrate on the, I guess, risk and governance area of security. We have, again, similar sort of range of clients and people I've worked with over time, from very small companies right up to enterprise companies. So one of the things we wanted to do when we started Cyberscale was to take some of the experience that we've seen in larger enterprise organizations and how they look after security and try and relate that down to the smaller companies as well, and do lots of education. And obviously we're really pleased from that perspective to be involved with the resilience centres, which is a great initiative to help particularly smaller companies with that education around security. So I'm involved with the Eastern Resilience Centre, also with the East Midlands, and I'm also co-director of the Norfolk and Suffolk Cybersecurity Cluster, which is soon to become the East Security Cluster as well.
Brilliant. So I suppose we'll go a little bit about why this topic in particular is key for businesses. So small businesses are most at risk of cybercrime. They're also the ones least likely to have an in-house ICT team. So understanding the difference between what a managed service provider, potentially an in-house IT team, and then a cyber resilience company, along with those roles and responsibilities for each, is really key, especially if those companies are then looking to increase their cyber resilience. Now, IT teams have been increasingly busy over the last couple of years, enabling that remote working, probably at a scale that we've never been dreamed of. But with obviously that increase of devices and real estate, there's also the increase in risk of attack from cybercrime. And there's a concern, I guess, that companies who may not be aware of those differences between the types of company we're discussing might actually be putting their own company at risk because they assume or believe that certain things are actually covered that may not be. So maybe the first question is really, is there a difference between them? So David, you've been obviously an IT professional for a number of years. Can you do the job of explaining what ICT or an MSP actually is and does?
Certainly, yes. So I'll start just by covering the basics of what's generally understood as being covered by IT support. Firstly, we have the infrastructure. Your IT team will most likely provide and then maintain the hardware and software that form your network. This will range from the PCs to servers, network equipment, and increasingly common now, cloud-based resources. It will often also include things like telephony and mobile phones. The next sort of discrete area is the area of functionality. This is perhaps the most visible task that the IT team perform. This is keeping the hardware and software operating correctly. This is a primary responsibility for the IT team. And they would also typically provide assistance in the training and the use of software, and also ensure that the organised data is secure and access to it is controlled. There's of course an area of crossover to what might be considered cybersecurity. And under the heading of governance, the IT team will be managing policies to control each individual's use and access to IT systems. Most IT systems will have some capability to manage and enforce policies that control the aspects of a user's access to the system. The IT team will control these policies. However, because the typical IT team is focused on the functional aspects of providing the service, they may not have the skills or the time to take a detached look at the cybersecurity risks. Thus, we can find big differences in how well these governance policies are implemented. And this is really where the value of examining the system from a cyber resilience perspective comes in.
Brilliant. So Steve, where's the main difference, I guess, from your point of view in terms of what cyber resilience then does building on ICT?
Yeah, so I think David's encapsulated what IT and IT services generally are really well. I think the big difference is that typically IT providers are looking to maintain the systems, to keep them up and running, to make sure that applications are still available, that your email is working, that your mobile phones are connected, that sort of thing. On the security side, what we're obviously looking to do is to protect the data and protect the individuals. And those two aren't exactly the same thing. So, for example, if you ask a web developer to create you a website for your business, there's nothing in what you've just asked that says, "Can you please make that secure?" Yeah. So there's an open set of security standards called OWASP, the Open Web Application Security Project. And it's basically a not-for-profit organisation that creates effectively an industry de facto standard and has identified the top 20 cyber vulnerabilities, if you like, across the world for the last 20 years or so. And every 3 years they publish their top 20. Two aspects of that come up in the top 5 every single time they publish it, and both are to do with secure web design. Something that we call SQL injection or SQL injection, and another one called cross-site scripting. They're both very easy to code to fix, but they take a little bit of time to do it and to test. And that's a great example of the difference between getting an IT person to develop your website and getting somebody who has a security background to develop it. The security person should also be including everything from the OWASP and making sure that you're protected against those. So they do miss one or two bits and pieces, and I think we'll probably tease out some more of those during the rest of the call.
Brilliant. And Darren, so Steve's mentioned about information security. Is that just specific to things held on our computer, or does it go wider than that? Does it have a physical application as well?
Yeah, so information security would definitely broaden out beyond that. I mean, you know, in reality nowadays, because everybody's, you know, very heavily digitized, you know, it tends to it tends to be digital, and that's how everybody tends to store their data and process it. And I think, you know, when you know, Steve or I would look at an organisation, we would probably look around risk. Then we'd probably have a slightly different starting point. So rather than looking at the IT first and the technical capabilities and the technical gaps first, we'd probably start by looking at what's the data that you hold as an organisation, and how important is that data to you? What is the implications to your business if that data is compromised in some way? And there's different ways, obviously, that can be compromised. We talk about the CIA triad, which is confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And a compromise of any of those things when it comes to data, whether or not it's, you know, whether it's digitally held or not, can obviously have an effect on your business. So I think that's kind of, you know, the perspective is slightly different. And the IT and the technical side of security is one really important aspect. And if you're outsourcing to someone like David, then that's great. You know, they can take care of a lot of those elements for you. But there is more to it than the technical side as well. You know, the training and the organisational side of things. So yeah, it's a big area. There's a lot of crossover, and sometimes as a business owner, you don't know what you don't know, and that's, you know, probably the key difficulty.
Absolutely. So you mentioned there about training. Oh, Steve, go on.
Yeah, I was just going to say, just to expand on that a bit, it really looks at three key areas. So it's the technical controls that you've got. It's also the people that you've got. So the controls around people, and by controls, we tend to talk about what's your vetting processes. What do you do in terms of joiners, movers and leavers? So how do you move people around the organisation? Do you revoke access as they move? And then what happens when they hand in their notice or you terminate their contract, is making sure that you protect the organisation. So that's people controls. Training is part of that. And then there's your policies and processes around that, which actually document what it is that you're looking to do. So they all kind of add on to the technical controls. You would certainly expect your IT provider to do a lot of the technical stuff, but if you don't tell them what they have to do, and typically that's documented in your policies, you're not going to win that game. Okay,
so sticking with maybe the people, is there a difference within the sort of skill sets as well that you'd expect within an outsourced IT team and actually a security team? Maybe David, what would you expect from sort of the skills and knowledge within a team like yours?
Yeah, I mean, it's very true that there can be big variations. I would also say some of it is also about people skills. You know, that you can very often get, particularly in the IT support side, you get very techie people that know how to configure the hardware and the software, but if the communication isn't there, you're missing a big part of it. So, and I'm just picking up on what Steve said about the IT team needing to be told. I mean, that is an absolute key thing, and you know, one of the ongoing issues I face with a lot of my clients is that when people leave, we don't get informed that they've left because we don't have a policy in place to do that, and the account's left active well beyond when the person's left. And you know, it's such a basic thing, but if there's not a policy in place and someone doesn't know, it's their responsibility to tell the external team that that person's leaving on a particular date, then it gets missed, and you know, the potential security hole there.
Okay, Darren.
Yeah, I just wanted to expand on something that David said, actually, because it kind of got me thinking about something that we see. So there's a couple of issues quite often. So one is something that you mentioned earlier on, Fiona, which is assumption, right? So particularly when smaller businesses are outsourcing things, and I include IT in that, but it's not just IT. It's things like websites that Steve touched on as well. Even things like outsourced HR. There's a level of assumption quite often that because you're outsourcing it, all of the security elements are being taken care of for you. And that's not always the case. Some companies do it better than others. They have much more focus on it than others. And quite often also, there's nothing in the contract around those as well. So that's something to be aware of. So that's kind of one side of it. But the other side of it, and particularly within house IT sometimes, is that we'll find that actually the guys on the ground, the guys who are doing the IT, they know that there's some more that they need to do, right, which goes beyond their real their technical remit, and they might be trying to get that message across, and they might have been trying to get that across for some time. But as David said, sometimes the people who are in those roles are very technical people, right? And as David touched on, the communication skills or the way that they communicate those things might not necessarily resonate with the decision makers of a business. And so that's another area where actually a different kind of skill set is really important in terms of, because to actually be successful or effective from a security point of view, it really needs to start from the top down. But there's an education that needs to be done there sometimes. So that communication is really, really important.
Okay, so one of the roles, I guess, that I know that cybersecurity companies offer is something like a virtual CISO. Would someone be able to just explain what that actually is? What a company should be sort of expecting, I guess, from that role?
So I'll maybe speak to that first, not least because we actually provide that service. So a CISO is a Chief Information Security Officer. So typically that's the most senior information security role within the organisation, and I'm gonna tend to use the term information security rather than cyber security today, just because, as we said, cyber is based around the technical side of things. Information security looks at the people and processes as well. So forgive me if I keep dropping back to that. So the virtual CISO is basically you bring in an external expert on a regular basis, and that might be once a week, it might be once a fortnight, it might be once a month. It depends what your organisation requires. And their typical remit is to deal with senior management, as Darren said, to use the right kind of language that they understand and to help educate them. So typically that's going to be talking in terms of business benefit, business strategy, talking in terms of risks to the organisation rather than talking about which firewall ports are open or closed. So avoiding that deep dive technical stuff. But they also need to be able to communicate with the rest of the organisation. And if that's, for example, an outsourced IT provider, then their role will be to definitely look at the best interests of the company and make sure that they match up the security requirements to the business strategy. And that's a really, really important point that is often missed by organisations, not just SMEs, but they tend sometimes to miss out the alignment between business strategy and the security strategy. So as an example, and to make sure we don't drop into too technical terms, an organisation decided that their security strategy was that USB sticks, thumb drives, wouldn't be allowed. And yet the organisation used thumb drives as part of their marketing collateral when they did trade shows and things like that. So immediately you've got this battle between what the business wanted and what security wanted, and there is only going to be one winner in that, and that's the business. Yeah. So the CISO is, or the virtual CISO, their role is going to be to take all of those differing requirements and to do the translation in terms of language between the different parts of the organisation to make sure that they all have mutual understanding. They'll also then make sure, for example, that the organisation has appropriate policies and procedures in place, that relevant people are trained up, that they understand their roles and responsibilities, all of that sort of stuff. So they're pretty much a one-stop shop for all the activities that need to be done to secure the organisation. They might not necessarily do all the work, they might just parcel it out to individual teams, and it could just be, if they're in for one day a month, they'll spend the first part of the day reviewing what's been done in the previous month, and the second part of the day is identifying and dishing out work packages for the following month.
Brilliant. David, have you got any a sort of history of working with any virtual CISOs from your side?
I haven't myself worked directly with that. One area that has been quite beneficial is a lot of my clients have been going for some kind of cyber security review, like Cyber Essentials, which often involves them bringing in someone to do the assessment, and that really gets the conversation started around you're really reviewing, as Steve said, the business needs versus what's being provided. And I would imagine in a lot of cases, once companies start looking at things like that, they then see the need for someone to look at that in its isolation. Because I think, coming back to something I mentioned at the beginning, a lot of IT teams are so focused on their primary of keeping the IT services running and keeping them provided, and patching systems and such like, that they to add cyber security on top of that can actually it can just get lost because their eyes are elsewhere, and having an independent look at it really adds a lot of value.
Excellent. Darren?
Yeah, that's I think Steve articulated the role of the CISO or virtual CISO perfectly, and I think very similar to what we do. And I know David, just picking up on that point around the assessment. But we might want to mute Darren.
Yeah, I'll do that. Okay.
There we go. Thanks, Fiona. Yeah, just picking up on that point about assessments, David. I'm sure Steve has a similar experience. That the way that the starting point for most of our client engagements is that assessment, and then typically, as we identify things that the organisation needs to change in terms of strategy, and it might be around the policies, it might be just around putting the right people in places in the right roles, and all those things to improve over time, because it is something that takes time. They then would perhaps become virtual CISO clients later on as they see the need for that. It's very unusual for someone to come, basically because of that you don't know what you don't know thing that I talked about earlier on. It'd be very unusual for a client to come to us and say, yes, we need a virtual CISO, because at the starting point you probably wouldn't really know what that's about. But once those reviews have been done, then that's where it sort of comes from there. Yeah.
So if you were a micro organisation, or maybe 1 or 2 employees, and actually listening to this and thinking, what do I actually do as a first step? Actually using one of those frameworks is a good conversation starter, maybe, with that MSP. You agree?
Yes. Yeah, I think there's 3 different areas that they could look at, and all of them are initially they're free until you actually start to do some work on them, and free is always good for small organisations, I think, particularly. So we mentioned Cyber Essentials, which is the IASB scheme, which basically has been around since, I think, 2014, when central government mandated that any organisation that wanted to do business with government had to demonstrate their security credentials by passing that as a minimum requirement. There is an additional certification called Cyber Essentials Plus, which involves an on-site visit and penetration tests, but let's not worry too much about that. And 2 years before Cyber Essentials came out, the government also released what they call 10 steps to cybersecurity, which is still valid, and it all starts really with risk management and understanding what the risks are to the organisation. All of these are things that organisations can download off the NCSC website. They can start looking at that in a bit of detail, because let's not forget that security, whether it's cyber security or information security, is risk management with a different name. That's all it is. And we need to try and make sure that organisations understand this. So if they run through 10 Steps to Cyber or Cyber Essentials, or they can always contact their local Cyber Resilience Centre, which is going to be a good place for them to look as well, because they're going to get expert advice, and you obviously have your list of trusted partners on there as well, which will help signpost organisations to organisations that can probably help them with that.
Brilliant. So what goes wrong, I guess, for small companies who have IT companies that maybe are expecting too much? Are there any sort of key things that you've recognised over your years in the industry that you think actually this, companies should be aware of this? Steve?
Yeah, I think we've already mentioned it. Security is very rarely mentioned in any contract with your company.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the first things that you need to be looking at is potentially taking your 10 steps or Cyber Essentials when you go to the proposed service provider and say, these are our objectives. We want to comply with this. We want to get to Cyber Essentials. Can you help us do that? And if they say yes, make sure you document it, because then you've got something that you can go back to them and say, this was part of the requirement in the service that you were going to provide. And so to my mind, having that documentation, having that contract in place is absolutely key to making it happen.
Okay. David, you mentioned, before the webinar started, about Microsoft actually having a really quite secure platform for smaller businesses. Can you sort of just rehash the conversation again for our listeners? You're on mute though. Hang on.
Sorry. Yeah, so over my many years in the IT industry, I've worked with the sort of older style servers, and with them there tends to be several different levels that give you different degrees of control depending on whether you're an SME or a full enterprise system. But recently we've been providing an awful lot of clients with Microsoft 365. Now, I'm not here trying to do a sales job for Microsoft's behalf, but one of the amount of control it does offer in both what a user can access, the control for the device in terms of keeping all the devices secure and enforcing policies for things like disk encryption, remote wiping if they were to get stolen, things like that. And then for the actual control of data, as well as sort of basic security of allowing different groups access to different areas, you can actually provide security on specific documents about wherever downloadable, and there's really now a level of control there available to the smallest companies that just wasn't there even a few years ago. But it does come back to we've got all these controls, but someone needs to know how to operate them, and someone needs to tell that person what they want from these controls.
Okay, so moving a little bit on from that, if I say to you as an MSP, this is my new system, get it all set up for me, and you think, oh yeah, I've done it all, do you actually as an MSP go and test that system to actually see whether you've configured everything the way that it should be? I suppose I'm thinking of there's been some recent data breaches around unconfigured AWS buckets where data's, people have set it up thinking that one thing and actually have never tested it, so it's actually something different. Is that part of an MSP's role?
Well, I would be surprised if many MSPs, to be honest, do much testing. I mean, beyond things like data backups and things, doing checks on that the backups are working and that restores are possible. But when you actually get into actually testing out your policies are actually doing what you expect them to do, I imagine most MSPs would configure them and assume they're working.
Okay.
Sorry, Darren, did you want to chip in?
Yeah, thanks, David. Yeah, I think again, just following on from what you said, there's a going back to that assumption thing again. This is another area where if you move to the cloud, there's some great opportunities to increase your security and improve your security by doing that. But they are exactly that, right? They're opportunities. So there's again a level of assumption that when you do that, the security is there by default, and that's very not often the case. So the example you touched on, Fiona, with the AWS buckets, those are, the sharing of that data and who that's available to is now more secure by default, but it never used to be. So they were open by default, but you wouldn't necessarily know that unless you know what it's doing. So there's lots of things that are very accessible, but they're not necessarily secure by default. And it's very similar with the Office 365 stuff. There's some really great capabilities there that David said. Some MSPs will have much more knowledge of that than others, and some will do much more around that as a sort of default service, or at least advise you that it's there, than others. So again, it's as a company, when you're outsourcing something, I guess the key thing is not to assume. You have to do your own due diligence, right? It's down to you ultimately. It's your data, your client's data. It's your responsibility as a business owner ultimately to make sure it's secure. And part of doing that is doing that due diligence when you're doing the outsourcing. Okay,
so sort of sticking with that due diligence then, is there a way for companies to actually, is there a service for them to actually look at their systems and actually see whether they're configured the way securely?
There is, but I would estimate that a lot of MSPs, so pure IT MSPs, don't provide that service.
Okay.
Because it's a security service at the end of the day. And so good practice would tell you before you go live with any new system, you should be testing it. This all sounds like an awful lot of testing, and a lot of SMEs do not have the resource or the money available to employ full-time testers. So that kind of brings us on to another kind of outsourced service, which is, you might have your own in-house IT team, but you might then just outsource penetration testing. And bear in mind that there's lots of different types of pen testing. So you can do your external pen test, which is somebody trying to access your systems from outside your organization. But you can also do internal tests where they actually sit in your office or have a device sitting in your office, and they test to see what they can get to going out the way. But I think Dan made a great point about when you're going to cloud service providers, they don't provide the security for you. That is down to you and your organization. So you do need to specify what kind of security you want, and if they can't provide it, you need to get specialists who can. And one of the questions I had for David actually was, how do you identify MSPs that are qualified and capable of providing that baseline Microsoft service? Because anybody can fire up a tenant and do a bit of configuration, but how do you know that they're doing it as securely as possible? Is that something that the IT MSP will do, or is it something that you probably need another security consultant to come in and do?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and the answer, I would say, there's no sort of clear way of judging that just from the off. I mean, there are qualifications that companies can get to prove, let's say in the Microsoft area, that they've got certain levels of skills in-house, but that doesn't always translate to knowing that they're going to provide them. I mean, as with any new service you're looking at, as you're getting references, or perhaps knowing someone else that's used them is always a good start. But coming back to what you don't know, it certainly once you're aware that you should be asking certain questions, and are able to ask a potential external company about that, it would hopefully give you an idea of whether they came over as being experienced in it or not.
Excellent. Darren.
The question, Fiona, I've got a question for you.
Yes.
So just picking up on a couple of points there, different ones actually. So Steve talked about testing, and also David obviously talked. David and Steve were talking about the assessment of how do you assess the capabilities of a company. So how can membership of the Resilience Centre help, or how might it help in the future with those sort of areas?
So I guess in the terms of testing, Steve mentioned about pen testing. So pen testing is a level above one of the services that we offer, but we do offer through our student services vulnerability testing. So that's basically looking at your system either internally, externally, or a web app, and looking for those common vulnerabilities. So the vulnerability will go up to finding that vulnerability, but we won't go through into a system and actually see what damage or access that we can get. So that would be a pen test. We just do the vulnerability. So that report would then be shared with our customers, and then they can have that dialogue with their MSP, or potentially a cyber resilience company, one of our trusted partners, who could actually then put things in place to actually stop that from being a vulnerability in the future. And I guess because it's affordable, and it really is for those companies who can't afford to go commercially, because we understand that that can be very expensive. We are looking at supporting those small and medium businesses who wouldn't really consider this as being something that should be a part of their work processes, I guess. But from your point of view, things like vulnerability scans, is that a once a year, once a lifetime? When would you suggest that that even comes into a business plan?
So ideally,
question, I know.
Ideally you'd be doing that on a continual, regular basis, right? And I think just to expand on what you've said, just to kind of really clarify how I think that what the Resilience Centre offers there might really help small businesses, whether you're outsourcing, so we talk about patching, right, and applying security updates to devices. You might be doing that in-house. It might just be an automatic thing if you're very small. That's something your MSP definitely should be doing for you if you're and part of that contract if you outsourced your IT. But again, even if you do have it in the contract, how do you know as a business owner that it's being done and it's being done correctly and it's being done effectively? So where that sort of vulnerability testing comes in is really the verification of that. And you can identify maybe if there's some gaps in what's being provided to you, and then obviously you can do something about it. So a lot of this is really about making sure that you're informed to the best that you can be, and and it is difficult, I'm a small business owner, so I know how many competing priorities there are in running a small business, but this stuff is so important, and if you don't pay attention to it, it's going to bite you at some point. And I think the other thing I would say is the earlier you do it, the earlier you get into the mindset as a business owner of understanding the importance of this risk and what you can do about it to manage it, the easier it is. Because we'll all have experience on this call of going into companies where they haven't looked at it early, and now security is a bit of an afterthought. Now you're trying to reverse engineer a load of things that you've done, systems, processes, and try and make it more secure, and it's much harder to do that later down the road. So the earlier you can do it, the better.
Yeah, and I think is just to add to that, certainly my view on how often you should test is it depends. So it depends on the data that you're holding, how valuable that data is. It could be that you're holding a client's data and they've already said that there can be no breaches and that there's massive penalties on you if you don't hold that securely. So that may focus your mind on perhaps running vulnerability scans more regularly. At the very least, I think you should be running a full penetration test at least once a year. More often, if it's really significant or highly confidential data, probably bring in an external third party to do that fuller test. But certainly the vulnerability scanning, you can run that whether it's weekly or monthly. You probably don't want to leave it more than every 3 months or so, even if you're a very small business with only a couple of machines, because as we've seen, vulnerabilities come out all the time. You know, every single day there's thousands, if not tens of thousands of vulnerabilities coming out. And I'm not saying that to scare anybody, it's just a fact that that's one of the reasons why it's so important that we patch. It's so important that we check for vulnerabilities and that we test systems on a regular basis.
Interestingly, I was at a talk yesterday from someone who was part of the SANS Institute, but also works with EA Games, who obviously suffered their data breach. And he was talking about how people assume that hackers are constantly attacking these systems, and actually just that's all of their day is just trying to find these problems. And actually what he said is that there are smart, lazy attackers. So they do their scanning, they look at what systems you've got, what assets you've got, and then they just wait for that vulnerability to come. And then they just go, oh, all of those ones, there's where we're going to hit next. So I guess actually you're right in saying that penetration or the vulnerability scan is exactly, I suppose, what the attackers are doing, aren't they?
Exactly. And there was a point I was going to make on that, and it's just gone. Come back to me.
So much of that is automated, Fiona, as well. You know, and that's what enables hackers to do it at scale. And again, that comes in. It's one of the sort of assumptions that we might want to try and dispel is from small companies. Again, is that we're quite small. No one's going to spend time trying to hack us because we're small. We haven't really got anything of massive value. But there's lots of automated scanning that goes on all the time, and it will pick up the small companies as well as the bigger ones. And then obviously once something's seen, then there's a route in, and then we can go in and have a look around and see whether actually there is anything of value. And obviously data itself is valuable. Lots of very small companies have some really, really important data that is really valuable to somebody. So
that was exactly what I was going to say.
Excellent, look at that. So actually sticking with maybe the attack point of view and IT and cyber companies, when an attack happens, who takes primacy on that? If you've got, outsourcing your cyber and outsourcing your IT and you actually get stuck being hit, who do you go to first?
So I think that's a really, really good question. And again, it comes back to what contract you have. Yeah, because if your contract with your IT provider is that they provide services 9 till 5, Monday to Friday, and your attack happens at 4 o'clock on a Friday afternoon, does that mean they go home for the weekend? Yeah, typically with so incident responders, again, they're not going to be people that you employ directly yourself. They're almost certainly going to be a third-party company. And the point I'd like to make on that is make sure you've identified who you're going to use for incident response before incidents happen. You don't want to be phoning around looking for somebody to come and help as the incident is ongoing. So do some research and find 2 or 3 companies that you can talk to that you then trust and that you want to be able to use. Make sure you've got their details, a hard copy somewhere that you can get access to, because if your system's been hit with ransomware, for example, you're not going to find those contact details on your system because you can't get access. So I think there's probably a whole webinar about that, about incident response and how you manage it. But typically, I would suggest that it's going to be a requirement that you would contact both groups and they would have to work together. Therefore, your contracts with both probably need to reflect that. And you need to make sure that if you do declare an incident, that both groups are going to attend or at least be virtually available so that they can work through things with you as they happen.
I think you're right, there probably is a full webinar about that. But yeah, absolutely. I think, two really important things. I think what you've said is absolutely bang on. It's about being prepared and knowing what you're going to do in advance, and try and take as much emotion and panic out of that situation as you can when it does happen. So as a small company, probably two really important things. One is just a contact list of who you're going to contact, and the other is probably just a simple checklist of the things that you need to go through. And also just bear in mind that from a managing that situation point of view, it's not just the detection and the cleanup and the containment, which are the things that obviously your IT guys would do for you typically, but it's also the communication around that. So the communication internally with your business, and possibly the communication with your clients as well. So have a view of how that's going to work, and who you might need to talk to, and how you might need to manage social media and even the press and those kind of things.
Brilliant. What about you, David? Have you had been put in that experience before?
Yes, well, certainly not too often, but yes, there have been incidents, yeah, I mean, I would say a lot of people, unless they had the foresight, as Steve was saying, have an actual arrangement with someone that can specifically deal with incident response. Your IT provider is likely to be your first point of contact. Obviously, then it gets into the whole specifics of what the incident was and what's needed, but again, I would think once the immediate problem had been hopefully resolved, bringing in someone again at that point to look further at how it happened and what needs changed in order to prevent something similar happening again, is obviously very, very beneficial.
Yeah. So I suppose from that point of view, are there MSPs who actually partner specifically with cyber firms to provide that extra bit that I suppose they recognise that they can't deal with, but also have that instant response potential through just one port of call rather than having those two outsourced?
Yeah, I'm genuinely not. I mean, very large IT companies may try and cover both in-house, but the smaller ones, I'm not aware of a partnership. Although, Darren, did you have something?
No, I'm not. And what I was going to say is that's something actually we've tried to pursue. We've talked to quite a few MSPs to try and get that sort of partnership arrangement, and we've got some sort of loose arrangements with some, but we've found it actually really difficult to do that. I think there's a few various reasons for that I won't go into, but I think it would be a really good model. I believe that would be a really, really beneficial thing to do, because you've got two areas of expertise there, and actually if the right people can provide the right service and the right advice at the right time and work closely together, then I think there'd be a huge amount of value there.
I think there are some, but they're the exception rather than the rule. I've certainly come across I think 2 or 3 that I've worked with in the past, where we've looked at building a relationship between them as an MSP and the company I've been working with as their security provider, and looking at how those services can be used. I've also seen the model where the IT company has outsourced stuff back out to us, for example, so or to other organizations where they're seen as the security experts. So typically when I've seen it, it's been managed by the MSP, and they've brought in the security experts as required. And as we said earlier, you don't expect to have pen testers on your payroll, you don't expect to have incident responders, you don't have to expect to have forensic analysts on your payroll. And so typically that's where the MSP would join up with an external cyber company and bring in those people as and when required.
Brilliant. I'm very aware of the time. We've only got 10 minutes left in our session, so if anyone has any questions, please just put them into your chat. Otherwise we'll do a little bit of a roundup, I guess, about what we've actually spoken about. So really, the key things have come out of the conversation is that communication between clients and MSPs is key, and actually utilising frameworks such as the 10 Steps to Cyber or Cyber Essentials is actually a really good way of looking at what the MSP currently provides, and actually where there might be issues that you need to have that further in-depth conversation about, and actually maybe change policies and processes. But IT is all about that reacting to what the client wants and needs at the time. So, you know, getting everything working and potentially not as aware, I guess, or testing that the security is actually as secure, I suppose, as it 100% could be. And then that's where the cyber resilience companies come into it, is actually looking at those forward threats. What can we do to make it better? How do you keep that information security tight? And also doing that testing just to make sure that everything is on as it should be. Yeah. Anything, I suppose, to add to that? And I suppose having those, one thing we didn't really talk about was actually that incident response, actually testing that incident response before it actually happens, doing that business continuity plan. And again, that must involve IT as well as a cyber company, I guess.
Absolutely. So yeah, I think there's a number of areas that organisations can be testing, and David mentioned one really early on in the talk, which was around backups. You know, I think we've probably all seen backup regimes which say that they're backing up and that they're doing what they're supposed to be doing, but when you take the backup media and you try and restore from it, you find that it's blank because, I don't know, back in the old day with tapes, you've probably left the read-only tab on it or something like that. So making sure that you test that is quite straightforward, but also testing your business continuity plans, your incident response plans, knowing who you're going to contact and when. All of those are really, really important. And the one other thing that I just raised, there is another free resource that organisations can sign up to, which is the Cyber Information Sharing Platform, CISP. Again, that's run through the National Cyber Security Centre, NCSC. I would definitely recommend that any organisations that are listening to this go ahead and sign up to that. They'll get a lot of good advice from industry experts. It's all free, so they're basically flagging incidents and issues that they see and talking about ways of resolving those. So it might be one way of helping to direct your IT and information security service providers.
Brilliant.
Just wanted to add something, as well as obviously the resilience centres. I think we've talked a couple of times about different things that the NCSC can provide in terms of advice. So one is the starting point, you know, that 10 steps, great starting point, really good information, lots of information on there, which is targeted at different levels of understanding as well. So there's some that's targeted at business owners, there's some that's targeted for IT teams. So it's really well written. And there's lots and lots of really good information on there as well. So again, you know, with incident response plans, there's something called exercise in a box, which you can use as a starting point for maybe building some plans to test your incident response capability. So I'm a big fan of what the NCSC does, and it's something particularly for small businesses. It's all free advice. I always suggest to people that they go and have a good look at that to help educate themselves.
Brilliant. Right. Has anyone else got anything else they would like to say? I'd like to then thank you very, very much for joining us. Special thanks to our speakers today, so David, Darren and Steve. It's been interesting, and hopefully everyone's found something useful about the conversation. The recording will be put up on our YouTube, so you can review it at your leisure. Otherwise, thank you very much.
Thank you for having us, Fiona.
Thanks all.
Thanks all.